Grace Bennett had learned over 5 years of marriage that silence could be its own kind of language, and that in the Whitfield house, silence was the only language her husband seemed fluent in. Marcus Whitfield was the CEO of Whitfield Aerospace, a man whose name appeared in business magazines more often than it appeared on her lips, because by the 3rd year of their marriage, she had simply stopped expecting him to answer when she spoke. Their marriage had never been born of love, not in the way people meant it in movies or in the quiet daydreams she used to have as a girl growing up in a modest house outside Denver. It had been born of paper and signatures, a merger between her father's struggling engineering firm and Marcus's aerospace empire, a business arrangement dressed up in a white gown and a rented chapel, and everyone at the wedding had smiled for the cameras while knowing, in the particular way people know things they don't say aloud, that this was a transaction disguised as a beginning. For the first year, Grace had told herself that love could grow in soil that started this cold, that patience was simply the price of a happy ending, and she had planted small seeds of hope everywhere she could. Learning Marcus's coffee order without being asked, remembering which meetings left him tense and which ones left him merely tired, keeping his favorite sweater freshly folded on the chair by the window because he liked the smell of the cedar closet on cold mornings. She had done this not because anyone required it of her, but because caring for someone, even someone who barely looked at her, felt better to Grace than the alternative, which was becoming as hollow as the arrangement they lived inside. But 5 years is a long time to plant seeds in soil that never once, not even in a single season, showed the smallest sign of warmth, and somewhere around the 4th year, Grace had begun to notice that she was tired in a way sleep did not fix. The particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent years being present in a house where she is treated as furniture rather than family. Marcus was not a cruel man, and this, Grace often thought, was the hardest part to explain to anyone who asked why she seemed unhappy in a marriage that gave her every material comfort a person could want. He never raised his voice, never said an unkind word, never once made her feel small in the way some husbands make their wives feel small. He simply did not see her in the way a person walking through a familiar hallway stops, noticing the furniture that has always been there. And Grace had come to understand that indifference, delivered gently and consistently over years, could hollow out a person just as thoroughly as cruelty could, only slower and with less evidence to point to afterward. He worked 18-hour days, came home to a dinner she had made and eaten alone hours earlier, and retreated to his study with a glass of scotch and a stack of reports. As and on the rare occasions she tried to draw him into conversation, he answered in the polite, distracted tone of a man responding to a coworker rather than a wife, and eventually she stopped trying, because trying and failing night after night had become its own quiet cruelty she could no longer afford to inflict on herself. The turning point, though Grace did not recognize it as such when it happened, came on an ordinary Tuesday in late autumn, when her father called to tell her, in a voice thinner and more careful than she had ever heard from him, that the doctors had found something in his lungs that they did not like the look of. Grace flew home to Denver within the day, and for 3 weeks she sat beside her father's hospital bed, holding his hand through appointments and test results in the particular waiting that comes with illness. And in all that time, Marcus called exactly twice, both calls brief and businesslike, asking whether she needed anything sent, as if grief were a logistical problem that could be solved with an overnight package. It was in that hospital room, watching her father sleep with monitors beeping softly around him, that Grace understood something with a clarity she had been avoiding for years. She did not want to spend whatever time she had left on this earth being a well-managed inconvenience in someone else's life. Her father recovered slowly, and by the time Grace returned to the house on Cypress Lane that she and Marcus shared, she had already begun making a list in her mind, not of grievances but of the things she would need to do to leave. She did not tell Marcus right away, because telling him felt strangely like handing him one more decision he could make without truly seeing her, and so instead she began quietly and methodically preparing her own departure, the way a person plans an escape route long before the fire actually starts. She found a small apartment near the hospital where her father was recovering, close enough that she could help him through the months of treatment ahead, and she began transferring her modest savings, the ones she had kept separate out of some instinct she had never examined too closely, into an account only she could access. She packed boxes slowly, one drawer at a time. On the evenings, Marcus worked late, careful not to disturb the appearance of a house that still looked, from the outside, exactly like a marriage. She told herself she was not being dramatic, that she was simply choosing herself after years of choosing a man who had never once, in 5 years, chosen her back, and there was a strange, quiet relief in the decision, the particular calm that comes after a long illness, when a person finally accepts the diagnosis and stops fighting the shape of things. It was Grace's closest friend, Danielle, who eventually asked the question Grace had been avoiding, sitting across from her at a small coffee shop with moving boxes, worth of secrets between them. "Does he even know you're leaving?" Grace admitted that he didn't, and Danielle asked gently but pointedly whether Grace intended to simply vanish one day the way she felt she had been vanishing inside that marriage for years. And something in that question landed harder than Grace expected, because she realized that leaving without a word would be, in its own way, exactly the kind of quiet, unspoken cruelty she had spent 5 years absorbing rather than dealing. So Grace decided, with the same careful precision she brought to everything else in her plan, that she would tell Marcus on a Sunday evening, the one evening he was reliably home, and that she would say it plainly without accusation, simply as a fact about her own life rather than an indictment of his. What Grace did not know, because Marcus had never once let her see it, was that the 18-hour days and the distracted phone calls in the retreat into his study each night were not, in fact, evidence of a man who did not care, but evidence of a man who had built his entire identity around being competent and useful, and had never once been taught, by a father who ran his own company with the same cold efficiency, how to be present with the people he loved rather than merely provide for them. Marcus had grown up watching his father run Whitfield Aerospace with an iron discipline that left no room for softness, and he had absorbed, without ever examining it, the belief that loving someone meant keeping them safe and comfortable and financially secure, and that the emotional architecture of a marriage, the daily attention and tenderness Grace had been quietly starving for, was simply not a language anyone had ever taught him to speak. He loved his wife in his own way, with a devotion so buried beneath habit and work and inherited emotional silence that he had never once said the words aloud, not because he didn't feel them, but because some part of him genuinely believed that providing was the same thing as loving, and that Grace, capable and quiet as she was, did not need anything more from him than what he was already giving. On the Sunday evening Grace had chosen, she waited until dinner was cleared and the house had settled into its familiar evening quiet, and she found Marcus in his study, glass of scotch untouched on the desk beside a stack of reports. He was not actually reading, and she told him, in a voice steadier than she expected it to be, that she was leaving, that she had already found an apartment, that she loved her father more than she loved the comfort of this house, and that she had spent 5 years waiting for a marriage to become real and had finally accepted that it wasn't going to. She told him this without anger, which somehow made it land harder than anger would have, because anger at least would have given him something to defend against, and instead he simply sat there in silence, the same silence that had defined their entire marriage, except this time the silence was not indifference but something closer to shock. A man watching the floor of his own life give way beneath him, without any warning he had thought to look for. Marcus did not sleep that night. He sat in his study long after Grace had gone upstairs, replaying 5 years of dinners eaten alone by his wife, of phone calls answered in businesslike tones, of a hospital room 3 weeks long that he had reduced to 2 brief calls, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he allowed himself to actually feel the weight of what his own competence had cost him. He thought of his father and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physically painful, that he had spent his entire adult life terrified of becoming a man who failed to provide, and in that terror, had failed completely at the one thing his father had also failed at, which was actually showing up, for the person who shared his life. He realized that he had told himself a story in which working hard for Grace's comfort was a form of love, and that story had allowed him to avoid the much harder work of learning how to sit across from her at dinner and simply ask about her day and mean it. The morning Grace intended to leave, moving boxes stacked neatly by the front door. Taxi already called. Marcus met her in the front hallway before she could reach the door, and for the first time in 5 years, He said something that was not businesslike, not distracted, not delivered in the tone of a man managing a logistical problem. He told her that he had spent their entire marriage mistaking providing for loving, and that he understood now, far too late by his own estimation, that she had been asking him for years to simply see her, and that he had been too afraid of his own inadequacy to look. He told her about his father, about the silence he had inherited and never questioned, and he told her, his voice breaking in a way she had never once heard from him, that he did not want her to stay out of obligation or pity, but that he was asking for the first time in 5 years for the chance to actually learn how to be her husband instead of merely her provider. He asked if she would give him 3 months not to change everything, because he knew that wasn't how healing worked, but to prove in small consistent ways that he had heard her. A year after the morning she had almost left, Grace stood in the doorway of the house on Cypress Lane watching Marcus laugh. Actually laugh at something her father had said over dinner. The two men who had once been strangers to each other now easy in each other's company, and she felt something settle in her chest that she had not felt in the 5 years before that. Tuesday phone call from Denver. A quiet certainty that she had not stayed out of fear or habit, but because a man who had spent his whole life mistaking silence for strength had finally learned, one ordinary evening at a time, how to actually love someone out loud. She had not gotten the marriage she had imagined as a girl, the one born easily out of love from the very beginning, but she had gotten something she had not expected to find on the other side of almost leaving, which was a man who had finally, painfully and completely seen her, right at the moment she had stopped waiting to be seen at all.